course, I think most of you will be very familiar with the name. I've been trying to read all these books produced by him in English, but then he's also actually basically written a lot, mostly actually in French and in Arabic. But fortunately, there's a publisher that will be digitalizing all his works, so you will be able to see all his works in digital form, and so we hope also to be contributing to that in Chinese. In the Chinese world, then I think also maybe over 10 books have been published. So I've been talking to different people, and then just only a few days ago, I learned from Erebus that he was most impacted by Samir Amin's dependency theory when he was doing his undergraduate studies. So, so I think most of you, if not reading his works, would have heard of him. 3 years ago, he started to have lung cancer, and in August last year, he passed away in a hospital in Paris. And I went to see him 4 days before he passed away. I thought he was still looking quite energetic. So I thought there would still be time for us to have discussions, to arrange for certain publications. But then, he passed away. And we are still putting together a collection of his works to be published by Monthly Review Press. And that would be a collection of his essays on Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So that would be in addition to all these works. So I brought them because I thought that if you are interested in some of the works, so you may want to borrow them. Actually, I also borrowed some from the library. So, the one column of this would be his works on the question of law of value, the question about accumulation on a world scale, and also about maldevelopment. So we know he's an economist, but actually he studied mathematics before. So he would have this background, and so he talked a lot about the question of value. And so and based on that, then his questions about on the discussions about the world, the capitalist world system. Then there's another set of works that he's written about the U.S. hegemony. So that would be both the political and the economic aspects. And one other set is his works on the Soviet Union, on China, and of course on Africa, where he has spent most of his time. I'll talk about a little bit about his life, and maybe the easiest thing is to start with this autobiography, A Life Looking Forward. And there will be a lot of interesting stories about his childhood, etc. I will come to that later. And for me, I feel that he should be also classified under cultural studies theories, because he's the first person to coin the term Eurocentrism. In the 1970s. And he has written on Eurocentrism, which is not only a political economic approach, but also a very cultural approach, looking at civilizations, the history of civilizations, and with that background, the current context. I made a copy for you to 2 pages, and I will come to that later because Samir Amin, Giovanni Arrighi, who was PK's supervisor for the doctoral thesis, Andre Gunder Frank, and also Emmanuel Wallerstein. The 4 of them had worked on 2 books. The first one was, they discussed the question about the crisis of capitalism. So then they had the first book, which is Dynamics of Global Crisis, which they wrote and published in 1982. But then they continued with that and published the book Transforming the Revolution, which was finished in mid-1989 and then published in 1990. And this book addressed the problems of the crisis of the social movements. And in both of these books, what the four of them did, which I think we could try to maybe take as example, is that they would start by talking about the commonalities in their approach, in their understanding about, in their analysis. And then each of them wrote one paper on that particular issue. And then at the very end, as conclusion, they would spell out their differences. And it's very interesting to see how the four of them align differently with each other on different topics. So I made this. You see that this conclusion is very short. It's only 4 pages. But then this is interesting because it spells out the differences between the four of them. And I will go into that a little bit more later. But then because of his passing away, well, I went to his funeral in early September in Paris. And then in Beijing, in early December, we also had a conference hosted by the Tsinghua University. And there, Wang Hui, Dai Jinghua, Wen Tejun, and about 20 scholars spoke in, well, we had the conference in Putonghua. And so they spoke about the relevance of his work, especially in relation to China. And then after that, then in mid-December, Margaret and I, we went to attend a general assembly of Codesria in Senegal. And in that, the Codesria is a network of African intellectuals and scholars that was also founded by Samir Amin. So then they had a tribute to him, and then there was a bulletin with a lot of collections of essays about him. Somebody had made a film about Samir Amin, then we gave a lot of comments, and so he promised to be revising that. But I will first like to show you a video of some photos and some parts that is about that our team put together on Samir Amin. Okay.
是伟大的祖国，是我们生长的地方，在这美丽的土地上，到处都有明媚的阳光。好山好水好。
Here. Both. Close together. Free. Okay.
Well, I have some very happy moments in my life. Taking in order of the age, one was my childhood. I was very fortunate, not in a material way, but morally with my father, mother, but more even my grandfather and my grandmother, who played a crucial role in my political awareness. Second was when I met Isabel. It was very quick, and we came very quickly to understand that we would continue for life, which is the case. It was a very pleasant moment. I had politically very pleasant moments. I think I shall always remember the deep pleasure, more than pleasure, which the victory of the Chinese Liberation Army in 1949, when it moved into Beijing, and later in the 1950s when it moved south, I was terribly happy. I was happy to the extent that I was naive enough to think that this is the end of capitalism. It will continue to India, to Middle East, to Africa. We'll do the same with the same victory. It was naive, but it was still a big. But I had also very sad moments in my life. The saddest is the loss of my daughter. That is the most terrific moment of my life. Also, I was very unhappy when the Soviet Union broke down. I was afraid of that since long time. I was afraid of that. But I kept the hope, long time, that they could find a solution, center, left, perhaps a solution as the Chinese, as less bad than the full breakdown, and the breaking down of the Soviet Union in those silly independent countries, to me is a historical defeat. But we bear communism, historical Marxism has a responsibility in that, a major responsibility in that. I hope that in the future we'll have some good news.
So we have actually a longer version, which is 15 minutes or so, and it's on the Global University website. But we thought we would make a shorter version. Samir actually he had been here, and he also participated in the second South-South Forum on Sustainability, which was held in Chongqing in December 2015. 12. And Department of Cultural Studies, we were also co-organizer. But for all the other sub forums on sustainability, then they were held in Lingnan University. Actually, I'm not an expert on Samir Amin. I have only read some of his books, and I hope to be finishing them, if not before my retirement. Of course, after my retirement, then I look forward that I could be spending days and days reading books. And but I also had the honor and the pleasure of interacting with him quite a lot and hearing him speak in person. And I also have done quite a few interviews with him, and they have all been uploaded onto the Global University website. So I can remember the first time we met, and that it was in Barcelona in March 2002. That was a time when there was the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in Brazil, which was attended by maybe over 100,000 people at the same time. And of course, a lot of people would be coming from Brazil, from Latin America. And at the same time, then there were also movements that tried to connect different networks. So there was one which was called Ubuntu. And it was promoted by the former Secretary General of UNESCO, together with some others, such as Daniel Mitterrand, that is the wife of the former French president, and also several Nobel Peace Prize laureates from Argentina, etc., from several places. And so I also was one of the participants in that meeting, which was try to foster a network of civil society groups and different social movements. So on the first day of the conference, then we went to breakfast, and I was at the breakfast table, and it so happened that Samir Amin was sitting opposite me. So of course I knew him, and he didn't know me. So he asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Hong Kong." And then he said, in Hong Kong, then you must get connected to a very, very good network. They have very good intellectuals. So I said, yes. Then he said, well, the name is called ARENA, Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives. Then I told him, I'm the chair of ARENA. And then he was very excited. But then, of course, he knew the first generation of ARENA fellows, and that for example, there was Mushakoji Kinhide, who was the vice rector of the United Nations University in Japan. And he also promoted a lot of programs to talk about social movements or the state of the people's situations in Asia. So Samir knew all these people, Joe Mo from Malaysia, Muto Ichio from Japan, Samuel Lee from Korea, including the current mayor of Seoul. So they were all, they are all ARENA members. So he was very excited. And then for that conference, I remember he didn't sit beside Daniel or other people. So every time he would come and sit by me, and then we would talk and discuss about Asia. And Samir thought that there is a lot of connection between Asia and Africa. We are on the same continent. And we also share a lot of common things, especially in terms of civilization. So if you look at his book on Eurocentrism, he talked about the many civilizations that had been there and that have still resistance against the domination of imperialism. So he thought, for example, he is half Egyptian, half French. But he would always refer to himself as an Egyptian because his father is Egyptian and mother French. And he, of course, he spent all his childhood in Egypt. So he had a strong identification with the long civilization of Egypt, of the Mediterranean regions. And of course, then he also had a lot of respect for major civilizations like China, India, etc. So, as an Egyptian, he would be looking at the world in a perspective which he also consciously framed as anti-Eurocentrism. And I made with Samir. Then since 2002, then we have been together in many places because I was also involved in the World Social Forum in different networks. So we have been meeting quite a lot in Africa, Latin America, in Europe, of course in Asia. And every time he would come to Vietnam or come to China, then I would try to meet with him and then and also to continue our discussions. So, I would like, because there are so many things to talk about him, so I would like to highlight just a few things. I made this photocopy of this dialogue between Samir, Giovanni, Andre Gunder Frank, and also Emmanuel. And with the four of them, actually, I haven't met Andre Frank, but then I knew Giovanni and Emmanuel, and so they would, because we would be attending the World Social Forum and also speaking in the same panels. And it is interesting because all of them are very famous and very well known about the theories on the world system. And on this one, please go to PK. He would know much more than I do. So go to PK and ask him. All these legacies especially from Giovanni Arrighi. And in this, I would like to highlight certain things because on the one hand, then you see these four main theories talking to each other, and then they say a friendly debate. So they always have the debate among themselves. But then, if you look at them, then even if Emmanuel Wallerstein had written and studied, did quite a lot of research on Africa, on different places, and even if Giovanni is also worked a lot on the tributary systems and on China. He wrote Adam Smith in China, in Beijing. So they are somehow also from the Western traditions, from Western universities. Of course, Samir also actually studied most of his in undergraduate studies in France. But he had this background in Egypt. And he was also very much involved in what was happening in Egypt. So in a way, so you can see that the differences in their understanding of history or in their perspectives for the future somehow it has to do with their this background. And just being very brief, because I think you could read the dynamics of global crisis and also the transformation of transforming the revolution yourselves. But then what I was interested in was the differences. I think somehow maybe because some of you may have studied with PK and some of you may have a dialogue with PK, so you would. Somehow, I presume you wouldn't have too much of a problem about the world system theories. So I'll just skip that, and I'd like to go into some of the differences, which are quite nuanced. But then maybe I should still. Highlight some of the common premises that mark their analysis. So I quote. They said, the existence since the 16th century of something that may be called a capitalist world economy, a holistic framework of analysis of this capitalist world economy, a belief that despite increasing opposition to the world system, the world socialist movement is in trouble both in practice and in theory. The reality of US hegemony since 1945 and the fact that this hegemony had now passed its peak. and the worldwide character of the so-called crisis. So that is their own summary of what they discussed in the first book. But then in the second book, it was mid-1989, so we can imagine so what was happening at that time in China, in the Soviet Union, and then later on in 1 or 2 years in the whole of the Eastern Europe. So when by the time the book was published, then they were aware of all these important developments, but they felt that the main analysis was still valid, so they didn't bother to go and revise it and with this. But then in this second book, they try to address the crisis in the movements, which they would term, which they would include anti-systemic movements, social movements, and popular movements. And they try to situate the movements within the framework of the capitalist world economy. And the division of work among the four was that Wallerstein would be taking a holistic overview of all the social movements for centuries. But of course, focusing more on the movements after 1848 with the Communist Manifesto and of course the 1871 the Paris Commune. Arrighi would be talking mostly about the working class movements in Western Europe and in North America. And Samir Amin talked about the movements in the periphery, which means outside of Western Europe and North America. And he talked about the movements with the goal of national liberation. Whereas for Andre Frank, maybe he's much closer to all the new social movements, because he said that all these old movements, the proletarian, the peasantry movements, etc., they were not effective. They were too old. They were too embedded in their own system to be proposing effective alternatives. So he would focus on the so-called the other movements, which sometimes we would term new social movements. So for Wallerstein, he said, what does it mean to be anti-systemic? Because all these systems, all these movements would be somehow anti-systemic. And he said, to be anti-systemic is to argue that neither liberty nor equality is possible under the existing system, and that both are possible only in a transformed world. So, of course, the transformed world is a post-capitalist or a non-capitalist system. And he proposed 4 objectives of concrete political action. You can see them here. So he said, we need to have the repoliticization of the mass base of the movements, reconceptualization of our understanding of the process of social transformation itself, bringing together of the 6 varieties of anti-systemic movements into a worldwide family of movements. And by the 6 movements, Wallerstein is the one who's trying to, synthesize and also try to see in what ways he could draw everybody together. So he said the 6 varieties of movements, anti-systemic movements, include the 3 old types: the social democrats, largely in the West; the communists, largely in the East; the nationalists, largely in the Third World; and 3 new varieties of social movements. They are new social movements, largely in the West; anti-bureaucratic movements, largely in the East; and anti-westernizing movements, largely in the South. So Wallerstein was trying to bring everything together, but he also felt that we need to have the de-ghettoization of the anti-systemic movements, that they should not be in the ghettos. But then for Samir Amin, he basically agreed with these views, but he was stressing a lot on popular national revolutions. And he saw that the revolutions had 2 possible ways of moving. One is the popular national state or the national power, and the other, which is mostly the case with these countries, the compradorized power or the state, the compradors. in Chinese, the 买办, 买办, yeah. So these would be the national bourgeoisies or the national states, and yet they operate with political independence, and yet their function is to serve basically the interests of the main hegemonic powers, which will be the USA and Europe and Japan. So Samir would be talking about these. He put a lot of emphasis on the question about national revolutions and national liberation, maybe because of his concern and also his work with a lot of African countries fighting for independence. So because that accounted for maybe some 1/3 of his lifetime. He was working either with the United Nations or with some of the international organizations in Africa. And he was assisting, but at the same time critiquing the kind of policies that that these governments take, and that is also where the famous strategy that he proposed, which was delinking. So I will come to that a bit later. So. But then for Samir, he felt that Russia and China had the revolutions, and these revolutions were not just having temporary results, because in both cases there was this radical peasant revolution. So while Arrighi would put a lot of emphasis on the proletariat, on the working class, in the West, Samir Amin put a lot of attention on the majority of the population in the third world, that is the peasantry. So because of his focus on the question of the peasantry, so he would be proposing that there is the need for the land reform and for the radical peasant revolution, and also because of this in Russia or in China, the peasant dimension did not constitute, although they did not constitute the essential dimension of the transformation of society, they had a very important significance. And somehow they could exert pressure on the state, on the government, not to go too far, not to concede too much, not to become too compradorist in their policies in this whole era of neoliberalism and world polarization. So Samir would be proposing that the principal task of social movement in the periphery of the system today is to impose the missing democratic dimension, but not to substitute it for the national and social dimensions, but to strengthen them. So he was proposing that there need to be democracy. It is very central. But the kind of democracy, especially the kind of parliamentarian democracies in the United States, in many countries, then they are just fake. Because they do not address the very central theme of the economic and the livelihood concerns of the majority of the people. If you do not have economic sovereignty, and also if you cannot have this decent livelihood, then having one vote, whether you say this is a sacred vote or whatever, it only sustains the current unequal system. So he was stressing that we need to have democracy, but it has to be together with social progress. And what does social progress mean? It means that for the peasantry, they can continue with the small peasant production, because that is the most sustainable. And actually, the world population, about 70%, are still fed today by small peasant production. Of course, in Hong Kong, 80-90% of food is imported from the States, from around the world, and we are maybe not so sensitive to this question. But then, we see United States not being a strong military power and economic financial power, it's also a very strong agricultural power, which is why the United States imposed the purchasing of wheat, for example, in Japan, after the Second World War. The instant noodles that we are all so used to, it was one means by which the U.S. Governing power tried to change the diet of the Japanese for rice, etc. So there were a lot of experiments to try to see how they could be importing and buying wheat from the U.S. Yeah. So in Korea, we also see the farmers' wheat revival movement for about 10 years, and the whole idea is that if we are now starting to switch so much to noodles and bread, but then can we have our own wheat produced by the South Korean farmers instead of importing that and relying so much on the United States? But of course, recently you must have heard that many brands, very famous brands of oatmeal, our breakfast that we are so used to, they are very contaminated. I don't know whether you have heard of it, because of the pesticides. And then if you trace them, most of these products are from the United States. And because of this large-scale farming, they need to use a lot of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So they were all polluted, contaminated before they went to all the different Quakers or different brands for the processing. So there is this domination. So that is why with Samir Amin, you see a very important focus on the question of the rural, on the question of land, on the question of the peasantry. Because if we are not only taking an urban cosmopolitan point of view, because for us in Hong Kong, we are so accustomed to going to the supermarket and we can have everything available. But then for him, coming from Egypt and working a lot in the African countries, and then also going to the Eastern Europe, to the former Soviet Union, going to China, then he had this very central concern about the peasantry and about food sovereignty. And that is why he also wrote the theoretical essay for this book that I co-edited with Remy Herrera on the question, the struggle for food sovereignty and the renewal of peasant societies. So the alternative is not for more large-scale farming, as is the policy in China today. There's the promotion of large-scale farming. In many countries, they also try to get the land from the peasants and then try to give the land to big corporations. But then that is not the way out. But of course, that is there will be a lot of discussions to do with the ways we envision a democratic, self-reliant, dignified society. So coming back to the friendly debate among the four of them, then I was actually quite amused because they said that they had a lot in common in the basic approach, but when you look at these few pages, you find a lot of differences. Actually, a lot of divergences, or they termed it more politely. They say we only had different emphasis. But actually, these were not really different emphasis, because they were, when one thinks that it's the working class, the proletariat from the West, that would be the main revolutionary force. And the other was saying, well, it is from the South, the global South, that is the peasantry, that is the main force for building a sustainable future, that they are actually quite serious divergences. And yet somehow I can sense the way in which they try to emphasize what they have in common, but at the same time keeping their different views. And I think that is what's I like what I like very much about this debate. So maybe I would highlight some of the debates, the differences among them. The first difference is Gunther Frank. Actually, he was very well known for the world system, but then he differed from the other three in that he said the capitalist world system didn't really begin in the 16th century. Because later he changed his views. He was constantly changing some of his views. And he said that actually the world system started much, much longer before. And there was only a shift from the East, from China, from India, etc., from the Silk Roads, etc., to the West. So he was saying that it was only a shift. So actually on this very basic premise on which they discussed the world system, there was this difference. But then I will focus a bit more on Samir. For him, the other three differed from Samir Amin on one very major question, which I think we could discuss more. Because Samir Amin said that in the 20th century, there were two major revolutions that changed somehow the world. And these revolutions were major attempts or efforts in the anti-systemic struggles. So they were the Russian Revolution of 1905 and then 1917, because there were two stages in the phases in the revolution, and the 1949 Chinese Revolution. So just now, when you saw the interviews that he did, that he gave, personally, he was saying that the happiest moment was that he met Isabelle. They were both students in Paris. He said it was very quick. Actually, it was just a matter of a few days, and then they started to live together. Yes, and then for life. Yes, so it was just a few days. There was love at first sight, and you ask him, he said, "Oh, you couldn't help it." Yes, and then the saddest moment, he said, was when his daughter committed suicide. Yes. And apparently, I heard that it was also because of questions about love. Yeah. So she had problems in love, and so she committed suicide, and that was very difficult for Samir. But then the two moments that he was happiest and saddest was related, one to the Chinese Revolution. So he was 17 in 1948 when he joined the French Communist Party. He went there to study. And when he was 1 year later, then there was the Chinese Revolution. And of course, especially from outside China, you see the people defeating imperialism, colonialism, and the very corrupt nationalist party, and you see a lot of hope. And so he felt that he was very naive. He was only 18. So he said that he thought that the Chinese Revolution would go on and spread to the whole world. And he had a lot of optimism. But then you also see why there was this strong love, intense love for China and the Chinese people especially. Actually, he has been to almost all the provinces in China except 2 or 3. So I think much more than, or maybe most of us. Yes. But then he said that the saddest moment for him was the breakdown of the Soviet Union. He could see the problems there. He was afraid it would happen, but then it happened in such a way that there was this major defeat that he could see, then the major failure in the revolutionary advances. So Samir would put a lot of significance on the question of state power, whereas the other three don't think so. They thought, yes, there were the revolutions, but if you look at the way they developed, they were more nationalist than socialist, and not to even mention communist. In a way, they were successful in building their own economy, and especially they were in catching up, in science and technology. So the Soviet Union had all these satellites, these nuclear weapons, and China later on caught up and also had all these nuclear weapons. But of course, if we look at all the nuclear weapons that we have in the world today, they are enough to destroy 10 planets, 10 Earths. But then 90% of all these nuclear weapons are owned by the Soviet Union, by the United States and Russia. So actually China had a few, the others had a few, India had a few, and North Korea now said, no, I'm giving up on this. So, but still, they would recognize that as nation states. So Soviet Union or China then managed to develop and managed also to eradicate the kind of poverty that was still affecting a lot of other countries, like India, like South America, like many of the states. So they gave credit to this development, and yet they felt that the three persons, they felt that the struggles of the movements, somehow had setbacks, met with setbacks when there was a very strong state power. And the state had its agenda to follow. And in terms of nationalism, being a nation state, then you could say that they have been quite successful. And corresponding with that, then there had also been the benefits diffused to the population. So, for example, apart from some of the main several moments, for example, during the Great Leap Forward or during the Cultural Revolution, there were major problems. Otherwise, then China managed to somehow combat starvation. And China is only among only one of 2 or 3 countries that managed to achieve the Millennium Goal. The Millennium Goal was the goal set at the turn of the century, to say that all the countries should cut the extreme poverty rate by half by the year 2015. That's the Millennium Goals. Millennium, anyway, it was agreed by all the countries in the United Nations. And by 2015, nobody mentioned this anymore because 90% failed. So, but then China managed, in a way, because of all these developments in the rural places, etc. And so now the United Nations, they do not talk about the Millennium Goals anymore. They talk about sustainable growth. Anyway, they would change, time and again. The World Bank especially, you can see the propaganda, because once I was in some meetings and I saw a book called Pro-Poor. So of course I was attracted by the title, and then you look and then it's produced by World Bank. So it has all the rhetoric and all things, and it has also a lot of former social movement people working in the UN, and they are very familiar with this rhetoric. They may also be very good people really wanting to do something, but of course, if you look at what the World Bank and the IMF have done, then you know. But so there is this major difference between Wallerstein, Arrighi, and Günter Frank on the one hand, and Samir Amin on the other hand. For Samir Amin, he felt that despite many negative aspects, I must stress that he didn't embrace the powers as they were, and he had been also very critical about some of the policies of the Chinese government or the Russian government. But then he saw there were many negative aspects, and these aspects included insufficient delinking from the world system, grievous abuses and absence of internal democracy, intellectual rigidities and dogmatism. So he felt that they were some of the problems that these states also have. And yet he felt that in the USSR and in China, there were real achievements. And he also felt that the societies will impose on the governments the submission of the external relations to the logic of the specific internal choices. Hence, they are not prepared to reintegrate into the world system and return to capitalism. Okay, so here the main argument was that how far could these countries, for example, Russia and China, keep the gains and the legacies of the revolution? The revolution, it was not just the work of the party. It was a lot of sacrifice by a lot of the population. So you see a lot of deaths, a lot of sacrifices. And before 1948, for example, the people who joined the Communist Party would be those who were ready to sacrifice themselves, and they were not thinking of a victory and after which they could be reaping all these benefits. But if you look at the membership of the Chinese Communist Party after the revolution, then it surged. And it surged because all the local landlords, all the local capitalists, all the opportunists would first join the party so that they could be having the benefits. And which was also why the Chinese Communist Party, in 1 year after it took power, had to wage the 3 antis campaign, anti-corruption, the 3 antis, 三反五反 etc. So because there was all these abuses of power, corruption, grafting happening on the ground. So, but anyway, Samir, he saw that the revolutions, you cannot just look at the political party or the state, because there were the gains by the people. And what would be the gains? For example, women's rights, for example, peasants' rights in their, hold onto a piece of land. And even in China today, we see that there have been the land reform, the distribution of land to the households. Of course, some of that has been eroding, and there is now the very serious problem of finance capital going to the countryside and trying to take advantage, and of peasants losing land. That is the threat, there is this trend, but then it is still, unfolding. And there are still contentions of different forces in trying, for example, for the peasants to keep to the land. Of course, in some places now, then they try to use a lot of money. So there, I just read a few days ago that in a particular village, there were only 330 households, peasant households, but they got a compensation of over 100,000. Not 100,000. How much? 0.1 billion. 100 million, over 100 million renminbi to compensate for the land that they gave. Of course, the land must be very useful and would be used for some. And of course, this is a very special case because they have such a huge compensation. So, but then this is not happening across China. So we don't really expect peasants to be able to get hold of so much money. But then in certain places, then sometimes you have these. So we have a real threat of peasants losing the land. But then still, the majority of the cases, then we still have this. But of course, in China, we also have another problem, which is the question of food security. Because food imports under the WTO, etc., have been so cheap, and then they have displaced the farmers. So already over 10 years ago, China does not produce its own soya beans for its overall consumption. The majority of the soya beans to make all the soya milk, etc., then have been imported from the United States and from Brazil. And then there are also a lot of major brands that appear to be Chinese and yet have been bought up by the multinationals. So except for certain strategic sectors like the banks, like some national state capital companies, and of course in certain areas such as very advanced technology, or of course the military side, then China, the Chinese government still hold on to some of these sectors. But then in terms of, for example, everyday livelihood items, then much of that has been bought up. Even the very well-known case of the contamination of milk powder, some 10 years ago, I think some over 10 years ago, later, then it was found out that actually 40%, the main shareholder was from New Zealand. Yeah, and the New Zealand company actually knew of this problem already a year before. So then there was all these. But anyway, these are problems, and we can go into all these when we discuss China today. But then for Samir Amin, then it is very interesting that he would be taking a very sympathetic stand in relation to to China, to the political party. He still hoped that the party could be, because of its hold on to state-owned capital, the way it could be implementing certain policies, it could stand on the side of the people. But he was also very outspoken in criticizing the problems. So just in May last year, it was his main, we could say that it was his last main journey, trip overseas, apart from Senegal and Paris and France. He came to China in May last year, and he was one of the keynote speakers for the World Congress on Marxism, hosted by some of the Beijing institutes. And he was very outspoken. He was saying that you are all so naive. You think that by conceding to the demands, the aggressive demands of the United States and of Europe, then they would accept you to be a member in the club, in the elite club. They will not. They are not accepting China or Russia or India as member of that elite club. They have their own alliance. So we know that the six main financial powers, they have, I think starting last year, they already, maybe earlier than last year, I can't remember, maybe 2013, yes. From 2013, they already had a kind of alliance to say that it includes the pound, the yen, the US dollar, the euro, Swiss francs, etc. They would support each other in case of problems of liquidity, etc. Which means the very core countries, they protect themselves and they protect the interests. So we have to ask, if the capitalist system is imploding, and if you have the unresolvable crisis in capitalism, then if the six core groups protect their own interests, who is the one to pay the cost? Who will be the ones suffering? So we have to, so of course, it's the elite and the rest. So it is the rest of the countries that would be suffering. So just one example. For example, in 2008, we heard of the subprime crisis right in the United States. And then the way to deal with this crisis was the QE, quantitative easing. I always find problem with this rhetoric. They ease, but then who are they easing and who are they making more difficult? So by quantitative easing, they are printing more money, more US dollar notes, but then you did not see the inflation within the United States. What happened was later we heard of all the Arab Spring revolutions, because, for example, Tunisia, they import wheat from the United States. And because of the quantitative easing in the United States, the wheat they imported doubled in price within 1 year. So all these problems of inflation had been transferred to the other countries. And that is also the background to the Arab Spring. When people couldn't buy bread, when they couldn't eat, when they have the economic problems, then they took to the streets. And then followed the political, the cultural, and other dimensions of the struggle. So in that sense, then I think what we are seeing in China today, which also Samir was very concerned with, was that China managed to delink, but then it is now giving up quite a lot on the whole strategy of delinking. So maybe I'll be very brief to talk about, and I try to end quickly so that we can have some interactions. So on delinking, this is also a very interesting book. So what he meant by delinking is that the whole world, because remember he started his premises with the capitalist world system. So it's the world system, and then with the Eurocentrism consolidating the influence, so all the benefits were going to this center, were at the expense of the non-Eurocentric, of the rest of the world. So by delinking, he said that whether it is especially when it is the question of the nation states, of the global south, they should try to delink from the imperatives imposed by these elite core countries. So how? They said, you do not just submit to all their demands. They will tell you, maybe you could try to build all these electricity power stations, you can borrow money from us and do this and do that. So you see all these World Bank projects, all these Japanese overseas development aid projects, etc. They were all in this trend. They say, they come to you, they say, it is good for you to be doing this and doing that, and I will finance only this part. I mean, I will finance only the nuclear power plant or this or that. And you will borrow money from me, you pay the interest, but then you have to contract my contractors. This is the very famous Japanese ODA, that the government would give aid to the Philippines, but then the Philippines building the roads or certain things will have to use Japanese contractors, Japanese personnel, Japanese maintenance, everything from that. So from Japan, many of our friends, Muto Ichio and others, then they have for over 20 years been fighting this ODA, because they say the ODA actually is not assistance to the overseas countries, it's assistance to the Japanese companies. And despite Japan's so-called stagnation for 20 years, we all hear a lot about Japan's stagnation in the last 20 years. If we can see that the Japanese corporations operating in Asia and in different parts of the world have been reaping a lot of money. So the Japanese stagnation is more referring to their internal economy. So there are a lot of tricks involved in all this. So by delinking, Samir was saying that the whole development of capitalism has been forced onto the global south, first by economic means, by political means, and also, if you do not agree, by military means. So I would recommend that you read the one book which became very famous after 9/11, that is John Perkins, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He was the first generation of economic hitman. He was contracted by his CIA father-in-law, who felt that he was trustworthy, and recruited by the CIA, pretending to be an economic expert. And he went first to Indonesia to talk to the people, and then to write a report with the conclusion that was already determined before he went onto the trip. to say that if you borrow money from the World Bank and if you do this and that, if you industrialize, you will develop and your economic growth rate will be certain 6% or 10%, etc. And with that report, then the World Bank gave the loans and then made these countries in bondage. Because some of the loans, they were not really that what these countries need. They may not be necessary items, and yet they were the ones paid afterwards. You have to pay the interest, etc., etc. I also heard from some friends that the EU was trying to pressurize Ecuador to get Julian Assange out of the embassy. And if you don't do that, we withhold the billions of loans to Ecuador. So there were all these stories. But of course, sometimes you may say this is hearsay. We cannot confirm. So, but then we can try to check, especially after the kind of blackmail that is there. And if the blackmail does not work, then they would use military means. So in John Perkins' book, he wrote about how he went to different countries, how then the U.S. government, if you will take the loans, then you will be my protege. If you do not take the loans or if you do not follow my path, then the military invasion. So what Samir Amin was proposing, and this is a very famous strategy that he proposed, is delinking. By delinking, he does not mean that I get isolated. But then you will set, especially for the nation state, and that is also why his emphasis on the nation states. The governments, the states, should be considering the internal demands for the country to develop. To help the small peasants to develop the industries which would be for the consumption of the local population, of their own national population, and for their own cultural preservation of the values, because he's always referring to these main civilizations that now have been looked down on even by ourselves. Yeah. But then he said that we have all these, and it is paramount that we give heed to our own demands. And then if the foreign loans come in, whether it is from the United States, whether it is from China, from Korea, then you will see whether that is actually what you want. If not, then you will not take it. So that is his idea. His idea of delinking is not that, I just cut myself off from. But of course, he didn't deal with the main question is, if you are not an obedient follower, then they will come in and with their armies. And that is what happened in Iran, Iraq. That's what happened with Libya, with all these countries. And so when Samir said towards a polycentric world, so that is polycentric, not only one center, it's a polycenter, so polycentric world. So we can actually go back to his theories about Eurocentrism. And I don't want to spend more time, but then this is a very rich book, which I feel cultural studies scholars or students should be reading. Because he took this, he was looking at the whole movement, and he was also critiquing how the West, saying that it was trying to build up its own so-called legacy and tradition. So they would be referring to, for example, Aristotle as their philosopher. But then he was tracing, he wrote very interesting stories. He was tracing how there was a gap of, I think, 200 years when there was a rupture, and there was no link directly between Aristotle or this or that to the current European civilization. So he went into a lot of details, and it's very interesting reading. So you can read it like a storybook. So finally, a few words there's no time to go into the details, but then a few words about Samir himself. 2 years ago, in this internal departmental seminar, I talked about some of the projects I've been doing in Global University with the Global University website. That is to interview people about their life and thought. I was always interested in how, what shaped somebody's subjectivity. Maybe from the family background, from the larger times. So that I have done maybe over 50 interviews. So there's David Harvey saying how he came to America, to the States, but it was already at the very last phases of the anti-Vietnamese war movements. There was Wallerstein saying that he somehow, by chance, was reading this and taking up this subject, and then somehow got pulled into all that development. And then there were also quite a lot of women, women leaders that I also interviewed. Then they talk about their lives. So you could go to that website, and that's also one major project that I will do after retirement to start to. Well, I think I already have about 10 projects lined up, and I'm looking forward to that. So I would be trying to be more taking a more critical look at how people then somehow would be taking not the mainstream paths, but rather alternative ways. So it could be different moments. I remember 20, 30 years ago, I came upon one NGO person from France or from Europe. And she said, what changed her was that she went to the Philippines. She went to the Smoky Mountain. Yeah, I also had been there quite a few times and talked to the people. And she said that she was there and she saw a mother with a young baby on the back taking the garbage. And she said that it's not possible. So there shouldn't be a world in which we have this kind of situation. When everybody will say we have to love the children, there's motherly love and all this, and then it was something totally shocking for her, and that is why she did something else. She became an NGO worker on questions of poverty. And I've come across many cases. So I always like to ask people and ask my friends what happened in their lives. For Samir, he gave a very interesting story that he told, and previously I only had a very cheap and not up to the standard camera that I used to film some of the interviews. So I don't know whether they can still be used. But then he once told me, I said, how did you become a communist? He said, I became a communist at the age of 6. So then I said, but how come? So he said, well, I was formerly a Communist Party member at the age of 17. But then when he was 6 years old, because his parents were medical doctors, and also doing a lot of work for the poor and not taking money from them and all this. But then once his mother took him when he was 6 years old, and they walked along the street, and he saw a child of his same age taking something from the street and putting in the mouth and eating. So he asked his mother, he said, what's he doing? And the mother said, because the society is the problem of the society. That the child could only, it would be so poor. And then he said one remark, he said, he didn't remember it, but then his mother later on told him why he found himself as a communist. He said, then this child at 6, he said, then I must change society. So that is why he said that he was a communist already at the age of 6, because when his mother explained the situation of this other child, because it is the problem of society, a social problem, he said, I must change society. But of course, he was also there in some important moments of his life. When he was in secondary school in Egypt, in Port Said, there was a very strong workers' movement in 1946 in Egypt. And he was a secondary school student, and he also participated. And there was a very strong, this movement, the students were there supporting the workers. and waging a strike. So there was the workers' strike together with the student strike in the universities, and he, as a younger person, then was there to participate. But of course, it had some impact on him. And he was there also when, in 1956, the imperialist powers invaded Suez Canal. We all know about the invasion of Soviet Union into Hungary in the same year, 1956. But then in the same year, because Egypt was about to say that they would take back the Suez Canal, so Britain, with the others, then had the army to invade the Suez Canal. And the invasion, they came, he was there just before the invasion, but then he was back in France to study. But then that was a time when there was this discussion, very heated debate, and the invasion. And then his house was right at the port. So he was very afraid that when they invaded, there was the fighting, and then his family would have the risk. So, but then of course we know that later on, then Egypt nationalized the canal. And so that's also, and then one other main moment of his life was in 1968. He was teaching already in Senegal, in Africa, but then at that time he happened to go to France and was there in the, hottest months, the 2 hot months of the 1968 student revolt. So some of these moments, I think, and of course later on then the Arab Spring, and he was back in Arab Spring in Cairo. And later on he said, so he wrote quite a few books on the Arab Spring. He said, later on, afterwards, after a few years, you see that it seemed nothing has changed. It seemed as if the system has not changed. But then he said, revolutions are places where the system doesn't change, and yet the people have changed. People participating, I think it's also the same with our umbrella movement, with our different movements, that participating in that, you may not be able to change institutionally something, and yet there's no one to stop ourselves to change. So we can always change. And then I think that's also what accounts for his optimism from his involvement in the different movements and struggles. So I think I should stop here because then I will have 10 minutes for some discussions. I've brought the books, but then in case you will be interested, please feel free to work together, so we can work together. And I also found one book which is very interesting. It's a kind of textbook of Samir's writings. So it's for, I think, for secondary school students, or for university students, maybe undergraduates. Yes. I cannot speak on behalf of PK. I'll try to get hold of him and then have the discussions. But I feel that, for Samir Amin, he used one phrase. He used the phrase, actually existing capitalism. He was against the idea that there was this question. Of course, he wrote a lot about the law of value, about this. But then he was against the idea of just a generalized, universalistic idea of capitalism. But of course, for some of the very core concepts, then he's Marxist. Samir Amin. He's Marxist because he would look at the law of value. And from that, then he looked at how in his books on the accumulation on world scale, and on dependency theory, he looked at how this has been translated into questions of political power and domination and hegemony. So he is in that sense Marxist. But then actually Samir also wrote some books about 170 years after Marx. So he was writing. And so in some of these books, he was also trying to debate on Marxist concepts. But then the reason why he stressed actually existing capitalisms was that he said that you have to look at the capitalism very specifically in the particular historical conjuncture, which is also why in Eurocentrism, he tried to look at the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe, and he was saying that he traced the ways in which the shift was from the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamia, to Europe, and also all the very specific changes that took place in these countries. So even for the countries that we would simply associate to be capitalist, for example, France or UK or the United States, then Samir would be looking at them specifically. Yeah. So I think that is why I also feel that he's very cultural studies approach, because he wouldn't be universalizing things. So, but then at the same time, I also feel that there has been a lot of critique about grand narratives. And I think that is also one reason why people like Samir Amin or others, then they would be critiquing postmodernism a lot, because they feel that somehow in postmodernism there is an abandonment of very crucial positions in analysis, which means if we can, at the same time when we look at capitalisms in its different forms in different parts of the world, but then at the same time we will still be using the word capitalism and not giving up the word, because somehow there's a tradition of the theories, etc., that we can resort to in our understanding of what is happening. But anyway, I cannot answer for PK. You go and look for him. No. Yes.
Why you are?
Why I'm interested? I feel that. Well, my interest, of course, first started with comparative literature. So I was reading literature, and from literature, I would talk more sometimes about, in terms of history, I talk about subalternity, subaltern perspectives, etc. But then because I majored in Chinese contemporary literature, and because I was doing contemporary literature, it took me 6 or 7 years to do my MPhil and 9 years to do my PhD. Yes, because I was reading up all the contemporary literature, and it was never ending. Yes, and but then from the literature of China, then I was trying to look at developments in China. So I have a very strong interest in China, and of course with the Chinese literature. Though I haven't really taught any course on China. Directly, but then I've taught some literatures, etc. And
PK's
yes.
background is very similar to Samir. He studied mathematics and then
political economy,
economics,
and then history.
studied sociology.
Yeah, sociology. Yes. PK must be sensing that we are talking about him now. Yes. No, but I feel that what I like about Samir Amin is that he's very open. For example, he said, the political parties, why should one belong only to one political party? We can, because different political parties, maybe they have different strengths. I can be at the same time a member of 4 political parties, which would sound so treacherous for some. But then the main difference between Samir, for example, and Muto Ichio, they all taught in Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, and somehow they were all sort of PK's teachers. So the main difference was that for Samir Amin, he felt that the emphasis for transnational alliances should first be popular movements, peasantry, working class movements, new social movements for the minority rights, etc., plus political parties, plus nation states if they are progressive enough to support these movements. And that's the major difference between him, for example, and Muto Ichio. Muto would say, no political parties, no nation state. They would be intervening and they would be too strong, and then they would impact on the autonomy of the social movements. And then and so we have had these debates for quite some time among the movements. So even for the World Social Forum, you know that when it was actually first started by Samir and some groups in Europe, plus some groups in Brazil. And they plus the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil. So, but then after some time, then they had one principle. They say, no, we do not allow armed forces, and we do not allow political parties to participate in the World Social Forums. But of course, because it was taking place in Brazil, the Labour Party, before it became the ruling party, then joined the World Social Forum. And there had also been a lot of support for the Palestinians, for the Zapatistas, but officially the Palestinians and the Zapatistas, because they also resort to armed resistance, could not be part of the World Social Forum. So there have been, I think, a lot of such debates among the movements, and then they have not yet been resolved. Yes. But I feel that somehow in their discussions or in this friendly debate, I think they, in whatever ways they categorize the social movements, somehow then they also try to, I think Wallerstein tried to adopt a very open approach to include all kinds of social movements so that they can form, significant force to protect the welfare of the people. And Samir, he wrote to me 1 month before he passed away, and he said that we should be seeing that what unites us is more important than what divides us. In the social movements, we always put a lot of emphasis on the differences, to say how I'm different from you, how we have different identifications, and yet at the same time we also need ways in which the different movements could be coming together. And I think actually with Stephen, with Chong, PK and Sun, many years ago, we had the Asian Luntan, for example. There was also an attempt, that was 20 years ago, or more than that. I don't know. I can.
Typo here.
Yeah. Okay. At that time, so I finished this one. So we tried to have the newspaper.
Lau Kin Chi is okay. In parentheses, Lingnan University.
Yeah, they always spell all our names wrong. No, the names were all correct, and all our affiliations were wrong. One is spelled. They spelled it in the French way or the Arabic way. But yeah, okay. But then, after 1989, actually here, with many of us, so we tried to also have the magazine and the newspapers to try to facilitate the dialogues among the different movements. And actually Stephen at that time was driving his car around to pick up the newspapers from North Point and sending them to the different universities in Hong Kong. 民間抗爭啊嗰時 Yeah. But anyway, no. We're talking about the movements, the need for a lot of openness and tolerance. I've been trying to do is to try to understand what our current situation from a historical perspective, and also looking at it globally. So in that sense, that we can call this looking at it as a world system. But then you can also, because I very seldom use that term. But then I would be asking, for example, my students to read The Open Veins of Latin America, to have the 500 years of history, where we see how there was these global forces converging or diverging to produce, to come to our current stage. So this historical perspective and this perspective of trying to look at it as somehow as a whole is also important, because I also feel that today the kind of financial domination, the kind of financial globalization, the military dominance is global. So the US, for example, it has all these over 300 military bases all over the world. And of course, this is global. So in a way, I feel that we have to address the issue, this perspective. But then actually I have more, I pay more attention to, for example, to climate change, to nuclear threat. And they are actually projects that rank more than this, yes, that rank higher in terms of priority. And for example, for climate change, you have to look at it globally. But of course, looking at problems, if it is just analysis and taking such perspectives, it will lead to a lot of pessimism. Because the way we look at the current stage of humanity, it's not human. Yeah. So all the disappearance of species, all the risks we put ourselves in, and even if we do not talk about financial speculation, only about the question of climate change, only about the 1.5 degrees average rate rise in temperature, that's enough to bring us to major catastrophes in 30 years. And that is almost consensus among major scientists. So that is, so I feel that in that sense, then we have this pessimism. But we always talk about, so you still need, some kind of motivation to work on. And that is also why I would be accused by certain friends as being postmodernist in a way, because I would also focus a lot on questions of subjectivity, on possible changes in individual and collective subjectivities, so that we can have the communities that could be working together. And then you also see possibilities of transformations. And that is also where the optimism can come. So the optimism is not only to look at, for example, defeats, because defeats should be normal. I mean, 1989 or the Umbrella Movement or the Arab Spring, of course, in some senses, they are somehow conventional and normal. But then at the same time, if we look at ways in which we work, so we look at them as, advances with steps back, and yet we have certain directions, certain orientations to go. And so maybe in the ways in which they talk about, they use words like liberty, equality, humanity, common good, etc. They use these words to term the ways in which we insist and still persist on having a vision for the future. Otherwise, if we really look at all what's happening, we are doomed to be pessimists. Yeah. Yes. Actually, I'm very pessimistic. But that is also why I try to see in what ways there could be ways in which we still have maintained activism despite the pessimism. Yes, but then to be very short, because we have the lectures by him in the Tsinghua University. So he spoke in English, and I did the Putonghua interpreting. Yes, so you can get the whole of that on the website. But then just to sum up, he said there are two major threats in China. One is the financial globalization. If China would go into the financial globalization, it would be the end. And then the second one is the peasants keeping hold of the land. If the peasants start to lose their arable land in China, that would also be the end. So he said there are two major threats to China. One is this financial globalization, the other is the question about the land. Yeah. Okay, so, thank you for coming.